are delighted today to be joined by Russell Weiss, who's a director of CGT Law, which is a customs and global trade law firm. And Russell is a customs and global trade specialist. He has a strong focus on helping customs brokers, freight forwarders, and importers and exporters proactively manage customs risks and opportunities. So for the past 15 years, Russell has advised on various indirect taxes, including customs duty, dumping duty, excise, fuel tax credits, etc. And this has given him the opportunity to work with government stakeholders, multinationals, individual customs brokers, and small, medium businesses. We're delighted to have Russell with us today, and I can assure you that he's one of the most experienced people who also manages to cut through all the nonsense in this field. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, Russell. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Collins, and thank you for that introduction. Welcome, everyone, to today's session, and thank you for joining me. As Colin said, I've been in this area for over 15 years, specialising in international freight. And like so many people, 2020 and 2021 has brought, I guess, things we didn't expect to see and impacts on our area of specialisation that we had never anticipated. We're still in a time of reasonable uncertainty, and that uncertainty is felt by not only importers and exporters, but also the shipping lines, ports, and indeed international governments who obviously regulate trade, and their decisions have such an impact in this COVID environment. Collins, I might just ask you to go on to the next slide. So today's session, I want to start off by just giving a little bit of background on how the freight relationship is formed and works. It's a bit of one that has evolved over time from being structured around freight forwarders who acted as middle people and arranged everything, but didn't actually carry out any real services, to today where the freight forwarder has a much greater role. And we'll talk about the impact that has on the actual relationship. And it's important to get that sort of groundwork because it impacts on everything else. We'll then talk about what we saw with COVID-19. In legal circles, what we heard about the most was force majeure and frustration of contract and what impact that had on your legal rights, and we'll talk about that. Some of the things that we're seeing, some of the particular things that we are seeing in a freight context is an increase of abandoned goods. We're seeing increased costs, increased unexpected costs, I should say. And there always have been unexpected costs in international trade, but I guess we're seeing a greater level of that. And we're also seeing a change in supply chain risks. And ultimately, the supply chain, if you think your supply chain has been turned on its head, imagine what it'd be like if you were involved in the trafficking of illicit goods and your entire supply chain was built around goods coming in the luggage of air passengers, and all of a sudden that supply chain has been absolutely brought to an end. You haven't got too many other options to bring your goods into a country other than smuggling them via cargo. And that's had a real change, a real impact on the supply chain risks for just normal traders who aren't involved, obviously, in illicit trade. So I do want to touch on that. As Colin mentioned, plenty of time for questions today, and it is very much the case that everyone's circumstances are quite unique to themselves, their export markets, their goods, their supply chain. Everyone's going to have a different set of circumstances. So whilst this is general advice, we are happy to answer questions throughout the session. Next slide, please, Collins. So the key principles regarding a relationship or a contract for the movement of freight. Now, I would say 80 out of 100 exporters and importers have a relationship with their freight forwarder, and they may not know a lot more beyond what happens with the goods, beyond what their freight forwarder tells them. So they know the goods will be packed in a container. They'll probably be the ones packing it in the container, but the freight forwarder may arrange for the trucking of that container, They'll arrange for which vessel it's going to be shipped internationally on. They'll arrange for the export declaration. They may use their overseas agents to arrange for the import declaration, or that may be the job of your customer. But the freight forwarder is really the face. But what is going behind the freight forwarder is obviously a lot of physical interaction with the goods, whereas the freight forwarder deals more with the paperwork side of things. And there's been a real issue about, do you actually have a contract with the freight forwarder, or do you have a contract with the carrier? Now, for the first, let's say up until the 1980s, the 1990s, it was the role of the freight forwarder was purely as an agent. So they were not the ones providing the service of carriage. They were more acting as your agent and booking that carriage with third parties. So you didn't have a contract with your freight forwarder for the carriage of goods. You had a contract with them to provide freight forwarding services, but your contract was actually with the carrier. Even though, so it may be your name on the bill of lading as the shipper with the carrier's bill of lading, but that's changed quite a bit over the past sort of 20 years, maybe even over the past 30 years. And it's not a complete change yet. So we're still in this transition period where quite often now the freight forwarder will be seen as the carrier, as between yourself and the freight forwarder. They will contract with you to provide a service of carriage of the goods, and then they will subcontract various parts of that service. So no different than if you contract with a particular builder to build a house, but they then subcontract every element of that house building to various tradies. So in that case, you have a contract with the freight forwarder, and then the freight forwarder has a separate contract with the carrier. And that's very important because it does impact on the rights and obligations of the various parties. And we see that in the key transport documents that are issued. So the bill of lading, there's two types of bill of lading that are often used in international trade. Two main categories, I'd say. One is the ocean or master bill of lading, and that's the bill of lading that the carrier, the ocean liner, issues on receipt of the container. So if it says Maersk, if it says MSC, that will mean it's the ocean liner's bill of lading. Now, if you may never see that bill of lading, because if you are contracting with a freight forwarder who themselves is acting as the carrier, they will issue to you a house bill of lading. Now, it may be identical in many ways to that ocean bill of lading, but there'll be some key differences. One is that it will be issued by that freight forwarder. So say it's Kuehne Nagel, for instance. They will get a bill of lading from MSC. They will have Kuehne Nagel as the shipper, and then they will issue their own house bill of lading to you. That is a Kuehne Nagel house bill of lading, and you will be the shipper on that bill of lading. So it does impact, though, because the forwarder will be liable to the carrier under the ocean bill of lading, and you will be liable to the forwarder under the house bill of lading. However, it goes a little bit beyond that. So there's this concept in bills of lading that is important to appreciate of they try to drag in as many parties as they can as being liable. So the shipping line, if it doesn't get paid in advance, or there's going to be costs that it may incur which it's not paid for prior to those costs being incurred, it wants to make sure that it has someone to go after. And they don't want to have this scenario where goods are loaded in Australia, but costs arise at the destination port, and the person at the destination port's like, well, I didn't have a contract with you. I was just receiving these goods, or vice versa. So bills of lading are drafted in a way such that the shipper, the consignee, the holder of the bill of lading, the receiver of the goods, any person owning or entitled to the goods, or any person acting as agent on behalf of any of those, is potentially liable under the bill of lading. And it's joint and several liabilities. So you can be liable as the shipper for the acts of the exporter, and the exporter can be liable for your acts. It's not necessarily the case that the bills of lading always go as far as what they purport to in terms of making people liable. But it is important to appreciate that the law does actually extend the liability under the bill of lading quite far. In fact, legislation has been passed, for instance, in Australia, so that if you present a bill of lading for delivery of goods, even if you're not named on that bill of lading, that will be sufficient to transfer liability and obligations under the bill of lading to you, as well as rights to you. But it also won't remove the obligations of the any other party under the bill of lading. There's been cases that have said if you act as the agent of the bill of the shipper, so you're the freight forwarder acting as agent, even though you're not actually a contractual party to that bill of lading, because you as a freight forwarder know that's a standard term, we will hold you as liable under that bill of lading. The main point I want to make is that bills of lading, be they issued by the freight forwarder or issued by the shipping line, have drafted very one-sidedly in favor of the carrier, and they are drafted in a way so that anyone who really has any connection with the consignment is liable for any costs incurred in respect of that consignment, even if those costs are incurred at the destination port, at the loading port, by the exporter, by the importer. Now, international conventions do apply to most bills of lading. However, most of those conventions only act to limit liability for damage to goods. They don't deal with liability for payment of freight and the like. So that's a bit of a nasty scene to set. It's not a great one for you, but I will say it is the scene and it is the circumstances that enable the inherently risky and unpredictable activity of international shipping to take place. These circumstances have been deemed necessarily and commercially necessary to make it worthwhile for shipping lines to engage in providing that service of international freight. Now, that will all come into play later on when I talk about the risks. So thanks for moving on, Collins. Now, in that context, we have COVID-19. And it turns the world, including the shipping world, upside down. I might get you to move on to the next slide. The whole upside down in a number of ways. Firstly, it's just generally been a given that we'll have access to ports and we'll be able to do the activities that are necessary to enable international trade. In Australia, we didn't have too many restrictions. Generally, logistics were permitted to remain open. We saw at some periods in Victoria, there was only allowed 2/3 of the workforce. But to be honest, the timing when that happened, if you compare 2/3 of the workforce in winter 2020 to 2/3 of the workforce around Christmas time 2019, or to 100% of the workforce in 2019, you're probably just at normal staffing levels anyway with 2/3. So in Australia, we had good access to ports, good access to warehousing, continued access to containers, but that wasn't the case around the world. We originally did have some port closures in China, or we had people fearing port closures at the start where China was the only place where COVID was, and they started sending their containers to different ports. Different countries dealt with it in different ways. We talk about the lockdown in New Zealand being the hardest. Well, it was harder than Victoria's from a logistics perspective. You were not able to access your warehouse and containers in the same way. If you were in food and beverage and the like, that was one thing. But if you're in normal retail and consumer goods, there was a lot more restrictions on how you could access those logistics services. And I'm not going to profess to know how each country around the world reacted to COVID and how they imposed conditions on their ports. But it is fair to say that at some point or another, most ports had ports and the supply chain had some level of disruption to them. So what that did was it wasn't necessarily the impact of the restriction itself, which was the number one problem. It was sometimes the uncertainty that it created, the unpredictability that it created. And shipping lines don't like that. Shipping lines, I guess it's very much like if you think of the Melbourne public transport system, the train lines, they have set routes and those trains need to run those set routes. And you have one signal outage at one point on the line, and all of a sudden that's the whole Frankston line down. And that, if it happens in the wrong spot, that can impact on the Cranbourne and Pakenham line as well. And before you know it, we're all moved on to buses and it's mayhem. And that's a bit what it's like in international shipping. Everything needs to run pretty smoothly and it's all built around pre-established routes, and you knock one port out of the supply chain, and all of a sudden you have flow-ons to other ports. And we did see that, and this unpredictability, uh, particularly out of China at the start. In March and April last year, we pretty much had a stoppage on shipments out of China to an extent. It was a marked reduction, and the global supply chain just couldn't quite cope with that. All of a sudden, the empty containers that should have been being returned to China weren't necessarily, or the same level of goods coming out of China weren't happening. You had containers in the wrong places. You had supply in China sort of stopping. You had demand for goods in Australia, Europe, and the US in sort of March, April, May last year, all of a sudden stopping. But then we had a great surge in demand. Consumers realize I can't spend money anymore on holidays. I'm perhaps not going to commit to a new house at the moment, or perhaps that large ticket item I'm not going to purchase at the moment because I perhaps haven't got the job security for that or the predictability for that. But I am going to go online and I'm going to buy a pile of stuff off Amazon, or I am going to go online, or I am going to spend more on food than I've ever spent before. I think food imports went up 33% last year. So all of a sudden we have this surge in demand, but we've got all our containers in the wrong spot. Our shipping lines have cut their services because they were sort of sailing half full or quarter full. They can't all of a sudden turn those services on straight away. And that means you got this massive problem, mismatch in supply and demand, and the supply cannot meet the demand anymore. So you've seen a massive increase in freight costs, and you'll all be aware of that if you've gone to ship goods. At the same time, we also had the impact on air freight. Collins, if you just go to the next slide, this was just a presentation from the start of the impact of COVID at the start of, the impact of COVID on air freight back in the start of last year. You'll see the passenger numbers there in the darker orange dropped dramatically, as we all know, in March and April. But you'll also see the air freight numbers drop there. And obviously, we're probably all aware by now that a large amount of air freight is carried in the bellies of passenger planes. And it's taken the air freight industry a little bit of time to work out to adjust those passenger flights to full freight flights and the like. And air freight's not too bad at the moment, but it is still, some lines aren't quite as strong as they used to be. But I can tell you in the middle and the start, sort of mid to last year, it was mayhem trying to get goods by air freight, either in or out of Australia, and the government had to set up an assistance mechanism, basically helping to fund and coordinate international air freight of agricultural goods and the like. It's moving on, Collins. So I've sort of alluded to this already, but it is very important, much like the analogy with the metro train system. It's all based on circularity, the international shipping lines. If we want to have passengers coming from Frankston, we need to have a train coming first from Flinders Street out to Frankston to pick up those passengers. And if that train didn't come, or it only came with two or three carriages instead of six, and by the time it got there, we're back to normal levels and needed six carriages, you're going to have a problem. And that's what we saw here. And this is really just sort of going over the issues I just talked about on the previous slide. I guess just on that last point there, though, the problems will continue throughout 2021. I was speaking to some contacts in the shipping industry earlier today, and they were definitely predicting that the problems we're seeing with demand outstripping supply, they expect that to continue for the rest of the year. And hopefully we'll see some easing around Chinese New Year next year. What happened this year with Chinese New Year, with people still not able to travel as much as would previously be experienced during Chinese New Year, there wasn't quite the shutdown that you would expect. So you had huge demand, you had people not traveling, Like, oh, well, maybe we'll keep the factories going at half capacity as opposed to that sort of full week shutdown you might have. So even when the shipping lines might have had a bit of breathing space and been able to realign a few things, we didn't. We still had continued demand for goods being pumped out of China. They're hoping that this year, this next Chinese New Year will be a genuine holiday in China and all the factories will shut down. We'll get a little bit of break of that, those goods needing to be shipped out of China, and hopefully be able to see a drop in demand. Moving on, Collins. As I alluded to, so one problem is the cost of freight. That's to do with both full ships, full container ships, but there's also the problem of needing containers. Now, Australia has traditionally been a net importer of containers. A lot of our major exports aren't containerized goods, all our commodities and the like. But to the extent we do export containerized goods, we export less than what we import. And you've probably heard this stat said before that our number one export all up is empty containers. So our containers, we have more. We always have a problem of more containers in Australia than what we know what to do, what we can sort of deal with. But if we have regular ships coming to Australia, then we can fill them up with those empties and get them back to China. But during the mid last year, we had a problem where those empty vessels weren't coming to Australia as much. So those ships weren't being loaded up. At the same time, we also had industrial action in Sydney, and vessels, as some people may know, stopped docking at Sydney, and they'd actually go down to Melbourne. Or we had port congestion charges. I think it was up to about 250 US imposed per container for vessels that did dock in Sydney, and that caused a big problem. What that meant is if you wanted to return an empty in Sydney and to an extent in Melbourne, you'd go to the shipping lines to take your container by truck to the container park, and they'd tell you that no, there's no room for it. You've got to find somewhere else to store your empties, and that was a crazy situation, and we're finding that throughout the world. But that situation sort of changed a little bit now, because even though the world's gone into a mad production of shipping containers, we are still in a situation where there's a shortage of supply, and shipping lines are actually now starting to prefer to take empties back to China. Just get the empties back to us. We'll put them on a ship, get them back to China, because we can use those empties and ship them to Europe or the US full of goods at a ridiculous rate. We're talking up to 15 grand in some instances for a container to the US. So even if you could get more money on the actual shipment from Australia to China of a full container, because you're actually going to be charging someone for that service, if it is taking longer, they would prefer just to fill up the container with empties and get those empties into China, where they can then sell them for that ridiculous lease amount and use them for that ridiculous amount of freight costs. Moving on. That obviously causes a big problem for Australian people looking to ship goods. You're competing against the revenue that the shipping lines could make from shipping goods from China. You have to be able to pay a price that justifies them getting an empty container in China in a shorter time period. And especially if your goods aren't going to China, if you want to send them to somewhere else in the world, well, then they have to compare that revenue they'll get for that shipment against if they got that empty just back to China. Tough times. So what might we see in the future? We've already started to see shipping lines requiring bonds for some of the costs that may be incurred on containers. That's a little bit different. Usually it would be the case that they would let you take the container on the hope that if you returned it late, that you would pay the detention costs or the costs associated with the late return of that container. These days, because they really want those containers back and they're not prepared to let them go with the risk that they may not get paid, they're asking for bonds, not with all customers, more with new customers, and it's not all shipping lines. I think just generally, what COVID has shown is that we can't always rely on things going perfectly, and intricate supply chains that are sort of just-in-time supply chains with goods coming from multiple countries and having many sort of complicated steps in it may not be the best idea for the next sort of stage of production and the next year or two. If we can't rely on all those supply chains being open, we can't rely on governments placing restrictions, we can't rely on predictable shipping line routes, those complex supply chains don't make sense anymore. And so we may see more complete production move to particular countries. And Australia might well benefit from that from a production standpoint. Definitely we'll need to plan well in advance. And, whenever I sort of do research on how to sort of tackle these freight costs, it's always book the freight as early as you can. We will see continued high costs, at least for the rest of this year. I can't see it going down significantly for some time. I'm not some doomsday sort of say around COVID and think the worst is still yet to come or anything, but it is quite still likely, and we've seen it with Taiwan, that you can have flare-ups and you can have interruptions. And as long as there's inconsistency and unpredictability and uncertainty, that's going to cause problems. And we may still see events happen which have a very short but sharp impact on demand for containers and freights in certain regions, and that will have flow-ons to the rest of the world. We did see some good things come out of COVID, though. Things that we perhaps thought wouldn't happen this soon or may not happen at all. Countries quick to adopt digital certificates of origin, shipping lines more willing to accept and issue digital documents. There's been a big push towards, eventually the use of digital bills of lading and the like, and that ties in with the use of blockchain for greater security of info or certainty of information. It's quite possible, and I hope that COVID taught us that with these things are all possible, and that when we're forced to show some initiative and relax things that we thought were perhaps set in stone, that can definitely happen. And the government is at the moment embarking on a trade simplification agenda that's both with imports and exports. So the idea being something like, you lodge an export declaration and those goods then go to New Zealand, but then the broker in New Zealand has to lodge an import declaration where they basically just repeat all the information in your export declaration. We're trying to look at ways where we can reuse that information. So trying to think in supply chains, how can we have it that the one information once verified is only having to be entered once? And that's part of this trade simplification agenda. So the government's got given a chunk of money both to the Australian Border Force and the Department of Agriculture to push that. Same time, unfortunately, COVID has also helped ignite or emphasize or blow up some trade tensions that maybe were there in the first place. But those geopolitical issues are sure having a big impact on trade. Speak to anyone who's involved in timber or wine exports or coal exports to China, and they'll tell you about how geopolitical issues can impact their supply chain. So we have banned products. We have products not banned, like wine to China, but now red wine is subject to a 200% tariff going into China. And the problem with this is you get very little notice. When it's a geopolitical issue and it's a response to something like a public statements regarding COVID or an investment decision made in Australia about Chinese telecommunication companies, you can't. It's very hard as a freight an exporter of goods to really predict that and plan for that in advance. And look, hopefully with the Biden government, Brexit has now happened, and perhaps we can move past that and deal with the new normals. Hopefully these things will overall lead to a smoother global trade context, but we'll have to wait and see. Next slide, please, Collins. Okay, so in that context, we've got all these uncertainty, all these costs are rising. It's still going to happen. A lot of people bring up force majeure, this idea if something unpredictable happens, how can we get out of the legal consequences of that? Well, force majeure is a concept that is well known within sort of legal. It's not a surprise to people. As a corporate lawyer and trade lawyer, I've dealt with force majeure clauses for a long time, but it's not a common law concept. So in Australia, when we talk about common law, we talk about the law that is used, the system of law that's used in England, Australia, the US, the Commonwealth countries, basically, where it's a system of precedent where one court's decision is used to create the law that will be followed in future decisions and the like. Well, that common law system didn't come up with a concept of force majeure. That was the civil law systems. So what's used in Europe, sort of partially in China, and other countries around the world. And under those systems, a lot of the law is not created by courts, but instead is created by legislation. And those countries that have those legislative codes have legislated force majeure provisions into those codes. So in Australia, the concept of force majeure, and in English law as well, which often governs bills of lading, it will only apply if the parties expressly agree to a term, a force majeure term in the contract. Now, bills of lading do have clauses that sort of operate like force majeure clauses, but unfortunately, they're only ever in favor of the freight forwarder. I once saw one in one of the shipping lines booking terms, so not a bill of lading, but in terms of booking that was even-handed. And I think whoever included that in there has probably got the sack now, but I was able to use that clause against the shipping line and get a good outcome. But it's very, very rare that they'll have a force majeure clause in your favor. Next slide, please, Collins. Now, I think that this is the MSC bill of lading, a clause from their bill of lading. Basically, it doesn't say force majeure in there, but basically it gives MSC a lot of rights if anything goes wrong. Now, MSC don't really need a lot of rights because the contract basically is a contract which says your goods may or may not arrive, but whether or not they do, you still have to pay us. But nevertheless, they still have a clause in there that along the lines of if anything happens, which means that we couldn't avoid, even if we knew this thing might have happened at the time the contract was entered into, we at our sole discretion can do any of the following. We can carry the goods by an alternative route, suspend the carriage and store them somewhere, or abandon the carriage and place them at your disposal at any place or port which we may deem safe or convenient. And nevertheless, we'll be entitled to full freight on the goods received for the carriage, and you shall pay any additional costs incurred by reason of the abandonment of goods. So basically, if COVID-19 throws up something which we can't really avoid by reasonable sort of endeavors, then we can put your goods anywhere we want in the world. You still have to pay us full freight. Plus, if there's any costs associated with abandoning your goods, you can pay us those costs. It's extremely one-sided, of course, but if you have a look at every other shipping line's bills of lading, you will find the same. Next page, Collins. So the issues that I guess we would always want to look at with any of these sort of scenarios, sometimes with force majeure clauses, and I guess I bring this up because it might be in your warehousing contracts, your land transport, might even be in your supply contracts with your customers or their purchase orders. If a force majeure event arises, do they have to do something to activate their rights? Quite often in general commercial contracts, you need to give notice. So have you got that notice? Have they done the thing they needed to do? If you're the one relying on force majeure and you've got those rights, make sure you understand what you need to do. Does it cover a COVID-19 related hindrance? Often they will have just a catch-all that says circumstances beyond our control. Now, that doesn't mean all COVID-19 circumstances are not under your control, are not beyond your control. Some things just might be more expensive or more or inconvenient. For instance, if COVID-19 causes an increase in freight costs, if it causes freight to increase 6 times in amount, that doesn't mean you can't perform your contract. It just means it's 6 times more costly. Work out if the clause applies equally. Does it give you any rights or just the other party? Does it apply to risks known at the time the contract commenced? Now, that MSC clause I showed you said that it expressly said it did, but other ones might say if any unforeseen event. And in that case, you might have a very good argument that a COVID-19 related issue is no longer can be claimed to be unforeseen. I've been drafting contracts for certain people around COVID-19, and it is now sort of detailing what is foreseen and what is unforeseen and the like. Does COVID-19 prevent I was sort of talked about that already. We'll just make it more inconvenient. So these clauses aren't designed just to get you off the hook or get a party off the hook if it just becomes more inconvenient, but when I say these clauses, I mean force majeure in general, but the shipping line clauses quite often will just let them off the hook if it becomes more inconvenient. Next slide, please, Collins. Frustration of contract. Now, this is a different concept to force majeure, and this is a concept that has evolved through common law courts. So frustration of contract occurs where circumstances have arisen which by no fault of either party, which results in the obligations under the contract becoming incapable of being performed. Pretty tough test, means incapable of being performed. So you really we had an idea of what the contract was on day one, and something is intervened, which means that it is completely different to what it is at the time we're now examining it. And COVID-19, the best example of that would be if you had booked a performing artist to appear at the MCG on June 20, and they needed to fly in from the US to do it. And not only could they not fly in, but the MCG would not be permitted to host an event. You would have a very good case that the contract had been frustrated. Now, it is a very strict test, but there are cases where, and these are pre-COVID cases, that where it's been considered in a shipping contest. And one sort of reasonably famous case amongst maritime lawyers concerned MSC again. They had carried goods from, I think it was England to Sri Lanka, and the goods, the shipper had paid for the shipment, the title and the goods had passed to the consignee, the importer. And that importer then had gone into financial problems. The courts had put a hold over the goods. Customs wouldn't allow the release of the goods to anyone other than that importer. And basically there was nothing any party could do, nothing the shipper could do, nothing the shipping line could do to enable the release of those goods. And MSC brought a claim for a massive amount of container detention charges. And the court basically said, no, it's impossible for the shipper to perform their obligation to return these containers to you, or the merchant to return these containers to you. The contract has been frustrated, and we're not going to enforce the payment of the detention charges after a certain date. So it does happen, and there will be circumstances where the performance, be it the return of the containers or the discharge of the containers or the like, is no longer possible, and frustration of contract may be a possibility. Next slide. The effect is that your obligations are terminated from that point onwards, but anything that arose prior to then will still remain as an obligation. Moving on, Collins. So I think what we need to think about in terms of all these risks and the like is, we know there are risks. Rather than relying on force majeure and the like, let's think about how we can allocate these risks beforehand. Now, we know if the shipping line, they're not going to carry the risk, so you're going to be stuck with it. But can you allocate the cost of shipping or the risk of shipping to someone else? Could you contract on Ex Works terms or FOB terms and try shift that risk to your customer? It might well be that they're not prepared to take the risk either, but maybe that's a negotiation you can have regarding the price of the goods. Be mindful that even if you try to shift the risk to an extent, the shipping line's going to try come after you if you're named as the shipper. So to really get off the hook, you really got to probably do on Ex Works terms and have your customer named as the shipper if you're an exporter. So think about your contracts, your supply contracts. Who's going to be liable for delay? Who's liable for unforeseen increased costs? How do you protect yourself against the customer no longer requiring the goods? Let's imagine there's a shutdown in your export market and your goods are no longer have any purpose there. Do you get payment in advance to try and protect that? Do you share that risk? Do you have to work with them to try find an alternative market? These sort of things are always better dealt with in advance rather than trying to scramble at the end when something goes wrong. Moving on, Collins. Okay, now I want to just quickly touch on abandoned goods and unexpected costs. Moving on, next slide. This is always a risk because as you as the shipper, you're on the line for container detention and storage and cost of disposal of goods under the bill of lading. And there's any number of reasons why someone may not need a container, may not want the goods anymore. And I've listed those on the screen there. I guess the thing that we've seen is that COVID-19 magnifies this risk. It increases the circumstances where the goods may need a permit. We're definitely seeing that with certain exports and imports regarding PPE and the like. Certainly customers there's a greater likelihood that customers will become insolvent or just not have the cash to pay, even if the technically under the laws of their country they're not insolvent because maybe there was a suspension or on those sorts of actions. They can't pay for the goods, or there's just no more need for the goods. So we're definitely seeing those issues arise. Moving on, Collins. Now, as I said, the risk for you is you're liable under the bill of lading. The thing I want to try to pass on at the moment is it's important to act early. And you speak to anyone who's an insurer in around freight insurance, they know how big a risk is. They say you've got to be aware of what's the tipping point. When does the cost payable by the importer to get the goods exceed the value of the goods to them? So when does the detention charges, the storage costs, and anything they've got left to pay you, when does that add up to more than what the goods are worth so that it's not going to be a commercial transaction for them to actually buy the goods? That's that tipping point. Now, if you can see that tipping point's approaching, you've got to do everything you can to try to resolve that issue, because once that tipping point has passed, you're going to lose your customer. Even if they've got a contractual liability, it's the honoring that contract is not going to be commercially viable. So you've got to try and negotiate a reselling of the goods, a reshipping of the goods. You might even, there'll be times, and this will hurt, but there'll be times where if you're owed money on the goods and they will say it's just not commercially viable for us to take them anymore, you might get to a point where you will say, you can have the goods or you can have them at this reduced rate, provided you pick them up within 7 days and take them away, or 2 days and return the container. Because I can tell you, I have seen disputes over container detention and storage charges, which are, 10, 20, 30 times the value of the goods. There's only so much value. If a good gets too valuable, it's not going to be in a container anymore. It'll be via air freight. There's only a certain value of goods that are placed in shipping containers. And if you've got detention charges of 150 US a day and storage charges on top of that, it doesn't take that long for your those charges to outweigh the cost of the goods. So you can't let this sort of wait just for a month or two and see what happens. It will always end up worse, and you end up fighting about the charges, the detention charges and the demurrage and the storage, and not the actual thing that was the heart of the dispute in the first place. Next slide, Collins. We have seen increase in unexpected costs. We saw congestion surcharges in Sydney. That wasn't necessarily a COVID issue, but it all sort of worked in together. But that was as much industrial. We're seeing storage. We're seeing detention charges. Now, if you have ever read through a bill of lading, they'll say we impose charges in accordance with our tariff. If you wonder, well, where's that tariff? You really need to go online, and you go online and it will be a bit of a maze to try and find the tariff. But when you do, you'll be surprised at how many additional costs could potentially apply. But shipping lines are well aware of what things can go wrong. They've had hundreds of years of experience, and there will be a surcharge for every conceivable event in there. You can argue about whether you were given notice of those events, because if you weren't given, of those charges, if you can argue the tariff wasn't properly incorporated into the contract, then you do have an argument that there's any amounts under the tariff are not properly payable. It wasn't part of what you agreed to. Shipping lines are pretty good at incorporating their tariff, but if I'm honest, the people who are worse at doing it are the forwarders. So this comes back to that issue of who did you have a contract with. If you can prove that you actually had a contract with the forwarder, it's up to the forwarder then to prove that they gave you notice of any particular tariff or any cost that's been imposed. However, just know that they may well have indemnity clauses that say, you indemnify us for any additional costs that we need to pay the shipping line. And in a sense, that's fair, because these aren't things they're making profits on. They're being charged these amounts by the shipping line. They didn't have any more notice of them than you did, and they're just seeking to pass on those costs. But there's always a legitimate argument there about whether you were given notice or not. Next slide, Collins. Okay, last thing I just want to touch on before we get to some questions: supply chain security. I know, look, this isn't this will affect 1 out of 100 people, but we don't know which person it will be. So I'll raise this now. Just as I said at the start of this, organized crime has lost their traditional supply chain. Now, there was always smuggling goods in containers, but there was a hell of a lot of high value goods coming uh, through air passengers. And we heard about it in the news all the time. But you're not going to give up on a lucrative market like Australia just because we've stopped passengers coming in by air into the country. Australia pays more per drugs than most places in the world. Particularly and for things like tobacco as well, we're a very lucrative market. You compare tobacco prices in Indonesia to Australia, and the cost of tobacco is the same, but it's actually just all the taxes that are imposed, and it is a very lucrative market to get smuggled tobacco into Australia. So the ABF has got a huge focus on this. They've said we've moved people away from the airports because there's no longer passengers to do security with, and we've got them at the post off the post screening the cargo coming in by post, and also the container yards. And they are seeing a big uptick in illicit substance coming in that way. Now, for how to protect your company, you'll think about your supply chain and how to protect it, and you'll think about IT, and you'll think about putting up big fences and CCTV. Of course, you need to do that, but that's a given. The ABF know you're going to do that, and from their viewpoint, where they see people falling down and where they see supply chains being infiltrated is around internal governance and personnel. And when it comes to criminals, there are some opportunistic criminals and there's some who plan things out. Now, opportunistic, it might be that they meet someone who they find out is in a supply chain logistics role in your organization, and they opportunistically take advantage of that relationship. Other times, there may be ways of actually infiltrating the organization through a well planned out longer term plan. I don't know the people on the call today and what sort of size organization you have. If you're small, you're not going to be the target of that. If you're bigger, then it's going to be more of a longer term. But the smaller organizations can be the target of organized crime getting in and using your supply chain for their purposes. Next slide, please. So what to do to address that risk? These are things you're probably well aware of, but do your employee due diligence, do the police checks, do the full reference checks, look at how they support their claims. And I can tell you, if I'm involved in organized crime, as soon as someone starts asking questions, I'm just going to go somewhere else, because I know for every one person who asks questions, there'll be another 4 that don't. And I'm going to go with the easiest one. I'm not going to put myself, there's nothing special about your supply chain that makes it more appealing to me. I'd rather, as soon as you make it slightly harder, I'll go to where it's easiest. Create an environment where employees feel safe to report suspicious activity, but they need to know what is suspicious activity. It might be someone informing you that we've got a change of transport company in this foreign market, or actually the delivery address has changed in this foreign market. And they're saying, oh, no, you don't need to check with this person. I've double checked with them. It sort of ties in with this communication between different areas of your business. How much is someone who's receiving this information, like there's a new change or we've just got to add this extra carton in, are they verifying that with someone, the part of the business that really should be in charge of that area? And whatever steps you take to help people identify risky activity, the things you do to screen people to make sure you're not having someone risky in your organization, you need to make sure these steps are also extend to subcontractors, because I can tell you they're as big a risk, if not more of a risk, than your employees. There was an article earlier this year highlighting that a subcontractor of Australia Post had used that position to facilitate the importation of drugs into Australia. And maybe they're a little lax because it was a subcontractor, thinking maybe it was the role of the subcontracting company to screen their own employees. But at the end of the day, if you can't be sure that they're enforcing the same standards that you would, then it definitely represents a significant risk. So next slide, Collins. It's certainly difficult times. I know I haven't given you a lot of good news today about international freight. I won't lie, it's a hard time to be in the market for freight, but I will say that in all of these all the difficulties with COVID, what I've seen is that um, everyone is faced with the same challenges, but it's those organizations who, either through good groundwork they've done before, good relationships they've built up, or just doing things the right way, partnering with the right people, they're able to navigate those risks. So maybe they don't feel like they're getting ahead themselves. They might be just treading water or breaking even, as opposed to being in a very good position a year ago. But compared to your competitors, they won't be able to cope with it as much. They'll be going backwards, and you'll lose some of your competitors. They just won't be able to survive this. So you being able to identify and manage these risks, even if it makes you feel like you're only just able to get by, it probably means you're doing better than some of your competitors. And in the end, you'll come through this stronger than them. And hopefully, when better times come, you'll be in a position to reap the benefits of that hard work that you've done. Collins, I'll pass back to you if there's any questions. Happy to take them.
Thanks very much, Russ. And certainly not a good news story, but I think the reality is the better prepared you are, and the more of the bad news you can cope with, because you actually know that it's coming, and you can make absolute strategy decisions based on what you know, the better prepared you will be for the world in which we live today and the one in which we will be living tomorrow. Just a reminder, if you have any questions, please type them in the chat box. I know we've covered a huge amount of ground today, and you might be a little bit overwhelmed by everything you've heard, but if something does occur to you, type it in the chat box. And if you can't think of it now, by all means, feel free to address it either to me or to Russ after today's session. In fact, send it to me, and then I can make sure that we can get the right amount of advice to you. Russ, just a couple of questions from my side. First of all, sort of starting at the end, I guess, when you look at that criminal activity that might compromise your supply chain, and you have a shipment that arrives somewhere with nefarious goods that have been included that you knew nothing about, how do you, first of all, prove that you did know nothing about them? And where does your liability to that sort of activity end? How much of it do you, in fact, have to wear simply because you might have been negligent in your supply chain securing?
Thanks, Collins. Look, I'll say a lot of the times you won't know about it, in that it will be the case that your container arrives somewhere, it will be opened and the goods removed, and then it will arrive back at you without you knowing. So the idea is that you never know about it. If somehow you do find out about it, and you should find it, it is intended that if you follow these steps and have good sort of whistleblowing or good due diligence, that you will find out about it. I think generally international enforcement organizations are aware that good businesses don't normally people who volunteer information and make voluntary disclosure of these things and bring it to the attention of the authorities generally are not involved in this. And I can definitely say from my experience with importers in Australia, freight forwarders and customs brokers who have been caught up in this inadvertently, there's never been an allegation that they've been involved. And where the people who are involved, you'd be surprised how often that the ABF or federal police has already been listening to their phone calls for quite some time, and they know exactly what the score is. Like, so for instance, in my work with freight forwarders and customs brokers, they're often called on as witnesses and they have warrants exercised on them, but they'll be told by the authorities, don't worry, we know you weren't involved. We've listened to the phone calls where the services were requested. We know what was said to you. But I would always say the worst thing you can do is try cover it up and deal with it internally. The odds are the authorities already know about it, and if you try to cover up and deal with it internally, you'll actually probably just make it look worse on yourself and make it harder for you to explain later on that you had no involvement.
Great. So if you do become aware of something, report it rather than trying to pretend that it didn't happen. Now, we have had a question that's been posted in the chat box. How do you think of the effect of TMS and WMS systems in reducing the cost of freight cost in COVID situations?
Look, it's not something I've had a lot of experience with. I guess different transport management systems I guess it depends on all these things. Always depend on how good the data going into it is, and how well it interacts with the various suppliers and other people in your supply chain. I think, I guess what I would say is anything that increases sort of visibility over your supply chain is a positive. And to the extent that whether it's a warehouse management system or transport management system, it probably helps with that communication between different people in the supply chain and does help with that sort of awareness of where goods are and the like. But, unfortunately, these systems can give you great data and let you know where things are and the like, but they can't necessarily help you deal with or predict an unforeseen event. I think I would always suggest if these systems make sense commercially for your business in a pre-COVID time, their value is not going to decrease due to COVID. But I'd just be, I guess, wary or wanting to see the benefits of how these things deal with a particular COVID risk before I use that as my main motivator to adopt one of these systems.